Yeah, because you
So, what did we talk about last week?
Oh! I did. I'm just kidding.
I have a free will.
I also know, free will, okay.
That's what I thought it was.
What did we say about free will?
I talked to my parents about this for like an hour, so I thought it was so interesting. Determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism.
Okay.
I know, I did the same thing, but then my dad was like, oh yeah, I remember studying this in school, and I'm like, oh. I thought you were an English major.
And original sin was our other topic.
Right. And, so what did these mean?
Determinism was that like you're determined, like you're not predestination because that's a whole different thing, but like your path is already set.
But yes. Yeah, exactly. So there's only like one way that the world could go. The circumstances are such that there is only one possible thing that you could do. You don't actually have free will, you just feel like you have free will. Okay. What's the opposite view?
Lots of views.
Yes, lots of things.
Or lots of different ways.
So if we draw our diagram from last time,
Yeah, nothing is determined.
all these like branching choices, each of these is a decision, right? Determinism says you can only go one way. Libertarianism says you can go as many ways as you want. You could go this way, you could go this way, you could go this way. You have all the options in the world. Determinism only says I have too many markers. That's what determinism says. And what is compatibilism?
No, you see, if you have many arms and your fingers, then you know.
Silence. Silence.
So it's like your will is determined, but your
Yes.
actions aren't.
Right, so we distinguish between your will, which is what you want, and your actual actions, which are what you do. So compatibilism says, it's like determinism, you only have one possible outcome, but that possible outcome starts at your will.
Didn't we debunk this already though?
Because the outcome comes from your actions. It says, okay, if you're doing what you want to do, that's basically the same as being free. We said, no, if you are actually free, you need to have multiple possible outcomes. If you have one possible end state, that's not actually freedom. Okay, what did we say about original sin?
It's not like the sin that we talk about like in the songs. It's like,
Right.
I just put,
It's like the
So we
sin you're like
distinguish-
born with. And like
Yes.
Oh,
hard to do
yeah.
that.
So we
Basically,
distinguish sin with a capital S from sins with a small s. And this one, Amy, you were saying?
It's like the sin you're born with, like when Adam sinned, and Adam and Eve said you were broken off from God in that sense, and so.
Right. So
Yeah.
we are born with a sinful nature. We are
nature.
born with a sinful
Nature.
We are born with a sinful nature, which causes us to become separated from God. What are sins with a small s?
Like individual sins.
Yes, like individual acts of sin. Good. Okay, so question for today. How do we know what is a sin and what isn't?
That's a good question.
That was
That is a good question. It is not rhetorical. I want theories.
Can you say it one more time?
How do we know? So if it's a rhetorical question, you have to say.
It's just like, I thought you were going to answer it.
Interesting. This is fascinating.
No, it's
insight
just-
into how you guys come to my class. How do we decide what is good?
By like past experiences? Or how do we decide?
What about our past experiences tells us what's good and what's bad?
So like consequences for certain things?
Okay, that's one idea. Consequences. How else might we figure out what's right and wrong?
Just like our, what is it called? Like our natural instinct, I guess?
Instinct, okay. Good. You guys are doing surprisingly well at this.
Well, yeah, going along with that, I was thinking like guilt, like if you feel bad for doing something.
Okay. I'm going to take that as being the other one. So those are the three major views of ethics. Good job, guys. Okay. So we're covering here not strictly, it's theology as well, but this is kind of moral philosophy and theology. We're kind of at the intersection between those, which is kind of where we live for this class, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, single past
So-
today.
What do you think? What's different between those three?
Wait, what did duty mean?
like your instinct and your habits versus consequences. What would be a situation where those two have different results, where they get you a different picture of what is good and bad?
Well, the first, I can consequences and you can feel bad about something, but not ever be punished for it necessarily. If no one ever actually takes the initiative to punish you, you don't necessarily have to be punished for doing something.
Sure. So punishment is external, where instinct is more internal who you are. Good. So let's actually do this. I want to cover a bit. So these are kind of these reviews that have developed over time. I'm going to replace these with the actual philosophical names.
And those logos and pathos, right?
Virtuism.
Oh, please don't make me do ethos, spaces, and logos again.
What was it?
Ethos, spaces,
Oh yeah.
logos. I've been doing that all
Aristotle's
day.
rhetoric, which is also an excellent book.
Yes, I've been doing that with American lit. My brain's getting.
I love it. So Virtuism. Deontology.
Okay, I like English better.
Can I just stick with the three things that were already up there?
No.
Fancy words that
Already
already
wrote them
the
down.
And the other one is Utilitarianism.
Oh, I just put
God.
arrows pointing.
Sorry, this is rhyming history. Yes. Good deal on that.
So let's do virtuism last. We'll do utilitarianism first. So utilitarianism says there's a chair behind me and it is morally wrong for it to be there.
So now you must be punished.
And the reason it would be wrong for me to be there, if you're a utilitarian, is that it might trip me and then I might get hurt and that's bad. So it's utilitarianism, it's linked to, so here it's utility, as in being useful, having a benefit for something. So it's about the consequences of your actions. Utilitarianism says the right thing to do is the thing that is beneficial to the most people, most of the time, most greatly beneficial. Right? It's about the consequences of your actions. Maximize good for people, minimize harm for people.
So would that be kind of like that one picture you drew with the train headed, you can choose for it to kill a bunch of people or
Right, so the trolley problem.
And that is why some people don't like utilitarianism, because it often leaves out a small percentage that end up getting harmed.
Right. So we have a train track. On one end of the track, we have 5 people tied to the track.
Is that supposed to be the other? Okay, well,
On the other track, you have 1 person tied. So right now, this switch is set to go this way. Here's our little trolley. That's the sound that the rails make.
Trolleys sound happy though.
Okay, our trolley is currently set to go this way. You are way over here. You have a little lever.
Upside down.
No, it's the lever. That's you.
So, you're at the lever. The trolley is currently going to go this way and kill you. We're right, Amy.
Yeah, I was gonna say because it's usually because the decision is, do you make the decision to kill someone even though it will save more people, but you made the decision to end that person's life in a way.
Right. So, it's on track to kill, literally on track to kill 5 people. You could pull the lever so that it kills 1 person. So the question is, do you pull the lever or not?
Yes.
So you say yes. So Cozy is a utilitarian. So why, Cozy? Tell us why.
Because why would you kill 5 people when you could just kill 1? I don't care who it is, but
Okay, but then the guilt is on you because if you do, I guess you're still gonna feel guilty.
Yeah,
Even if you
yeah.
but it's heavier on you
Yes.
if you pull the lever and in your decision ended that person's life directly.
Yeah, but
rather
then-
So is there a difference between letting 5 people die
yeah, but then 5
or
people
causing
die.
1
Yeah.
person to die?
I would cause 1 person to die. I don't know who it is because then I have 5 people who are gonna die.
I like to think I would do that.
So I like to think I would do
I'm
that.
100%
But honestly, it's
And most people do say, yeah, I will pull the lever. Because most people deep down are utilitarians, even if they don't realize it.
yeah.
Right, so this is about, I think, that saving 1 life is saving 4 lives, even if it involves killing someone, is better because it's a better outcome for more people. Does that make sense? Now, the way this works is kind of interesting. Because how do you determine what's the best outcome, right? So they have what is called the hedonic. Do you guys know what hedonism is?
No, it was
Spell it in my mind.
Hedonism, you said?
Hedonism.
Yeah, it's like paganism.
It's like what?
Paganism, but just a little.
Not quite. It's related. There are a lot of pagans who are also hedonists. Hedonism is the idea that the best thing to do in life is to like pursue whatever is like feels good, right? So here they're saying hedonic calculus. It's like you're gonna have like an equation to figure out what brings about the most pleasure for people, and that's gonna be your ultimate good. So hedonic calculus is what that's called.
Is that a literal like equation? Or?
Yes, and this is where people kind of get critical of utilitarianism because it's kind of weird, but you have these factors.
Wait, Austin, what did the calculus thingy, what was that? What's the definition of that one?
So hedonic calculus is sort of like the way of determining what produces the most pleasure versus pain, which is what utilitarianism is concerned with in their definition of good. So you have these factors. There are factors like, what is the duration of pleasure, right? How long does it last? More means it's a greater good. What is the intensity, right? If it's more pleasurable, that is good. If it's less pleasurable, that is less good. If it's painful, that's really bad. What is this is a fun word, fecundity.
Fecundity?
Fecundity.
Fecundity?
Fecundity means like repeatability. So that's like, how often is this pleasure going to be repeated? So a good example of that is, why would you marry one person rather than just having as many partners as you could possibly have, right? Why would you do that? Well, one reason is if you have one person that you're kind of stuck with for life, then that's going to be like you get to have a relationship with that person forever. It's repeatable, right? As opposed to if you're with this person for 2 weeks and then you go away and then, right, at some point this is going to dry up and you're going to be alone, right? So the kind of I want the pleasure that I experience to be something that will happen again, if possible. That makes it a greater good. Quality. So different pleasures are different, right? Reading a book is a kind of pleasure, at least if you're a certain kind of person. Spending time with someone you love is a different kind, right? One of these might be taken as better than another, right? Well, I think most people would probably say spending time with someone you love is a greater pleasure than reading a book, right? So we choose higher quality pleasures over lower quality pleasures. Certainty. So here we're talking in terms of when I make this decision, how likely is it to lead to this good thing that I anticipate it will lead to, right? You don't gamble because even though it could lead to a lot of really great things for you, it has a very low certainty, right? So certainty.
Come up with this.
Jeremy Bentham. And purity is the last one. So if the joy of the situation is mixed with pain, that is less good than something that is pure joy, right? So you get these factors. There are other ones too. Oh yeah, by the way, this right here, this is why working out is evil and wrong. Because although there is a great deal of good that comes from it, it is painful and good. It is an impure good.
Guys, we just came from volleyball.
He's right.
So utilitarians say that they're right, that exercising is wrong.
Okay,
No actual
do they
utilitarians
work?
say that.
This is my question. Do they go to work? Because like if going to work is not pleasurable, wouldn't you just not do that?
So they would say that there are benefits that come from going to work. Most of the time, the work you do is good. Oh, I missed one here, by the way. Extent.
Like if you don't do anything you enjoy, how do you make it?
Extent is like how many people it benefits. So that's an important one too, right?
Oh,
Pleasure
yeah.
just for me, less good than pleasure for lots of people. So presumably you're doing
that
something
makes more
that is
sense.
good for
Yeah.
other people. It's also the case that you benefit from your work, and that leads you to be able to have something that is
on
it's
the
certain,
it's
it's
really
fun, even if it's not especially like qualitatively good, right? There are goods that come from doing a job like not starving. That's a pretty tremendous
This
good.
is pretty tremendous good thing.
Yes. So yeah, there are definitely reasons they would say you should go to work. So, correct view of ethics.
Oh no, we haven't even gone over the other two.
Okay, we can wait if you want. Do you want to
Yeah,
wait?
let's wait.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna say this first.
That is the right.
It's got some, it's got some.
That's not
So, deontology. It's kind of a weird. Oh no, I meant to say something else about this. So the two guys who are kind of well known for this are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Whoa, that's what I'm familiar with. This just reminds me so much of history class. I wanna do this.
Yeah. And if you take a history class, you very likely do know John Stuart Mill. Not John Stuart Mill. Joe.
We studied utilitarianism
John Stuart Mill.
last year's.
He's also very famous for his civic philosophy, talking about like how governments should work, rights and responsibilities as they relate to the state. That's kind of what he's better known for. But he is also the main guy behind utilitarianism. So what happened is Jeremy Bentham came up with it, and then John Mills, I think it was John Mills Sr., whatever, his dad, was like, this is such a great idea that I'm going to raise my child with the single purpose of propagating this view of what ethics is.
Oh.
And that is how John Stuart Mill became the person he was. He was raised from birth to be a philosopher in this guy's tradition.
Oof.
Yeah, a lot of pressure, but honestly, for someone who's raised in that weird of an environment, this guy I think did a lot of good. I have a lot of respect for John Stuart Mill, and you should too. His book on liberty is probably the best treatise on government written in the 1800s.
Wow.
Anyway, so there are slight differences between these two, how they kind of play this out. John Mill does some things to improve on it, but generally he's just taking what Bentham did and he makes it more famous and he kind of popularizes it to the point that it's very much the most preferred view by normal people today. If you have no view of ethics, you know nothing about ethics, odds are this is how you think about ethics.
Right.
Okay. Deontology comes from a guy who, if you've ever heard anyone make fun of philosophy, you've probably heard this guy's name. Immanuel Kant.
Oh yeah. I've never heard of
Something
it.
said, you hear things like, oh, I can't understand a single word you're saying, and stuff like this.
I always wondered.
And Kant, by the way, is famously difficult to read to the point that he wrote in German. German students will read the English translation because it's easier than reading the original. So he's very opaque as a writer. It's dense, it's hard to read. He has weird words for things. So he's kind of a
Like
mess.
he makes his own words?
No, that's Shakespeare.
He uses words, but he puts them into phrases that are just kind of weird and didn't need to be as complicated as they were. For example,
Why does
his main idea in ethics is called the categorical imperative. Now, what categorical imperative means, this word in this context means like universal, and this word means rule, right? It's a universal rule. That's all it is. Why did you have to say it that way? But he did. I mean, he didn't say it like this. He said it in German, but the German is equally, why did you have to say it like that? You know? It's like super pretentious, super verbose for no reason.
Can you say it in German?
No. I appreciate your confidence. I appreciate your confidence in me, but my German
What, you
isn't
can speak
good.
Hebrew, but how do you
Speak some German.
Yes, the Bible isn't written in German.
There's terrible translation.
Well, yeah. There's translations in every language known to humankind.
Can you speak a little German?
What?
Can you speak a little German?
Not more than like counting and stuff.
Oh, okay.
I can say, or I used to be able to say good morning, good night.
Guten Tag, yeah.
Oh, no, I didn't remember how to say it.
it anymore.
I just know French. That's literally all I remember is French.
Yeah. My parents
Nothing else.
spoke a fair bit of French.
My dad's fluent in French and Spanish and mostly in German. It's a little rudely, but mostly. He's also a translator, so.
Oh, well, yeah, there
So it kind of has to do it.
So, the categorical imperative is this kind of universal rule. So deontology is duty ethics. And he says your duty is to do whatever, like any rule that you would want everyone to follow, right? A universal rule. If it's a universal rule, if it's a rule that you want everyone to be acting on, not just you, then you need to follow that rule is your duty. So a couple of examples of this. Don't lie is a big one for him. And it's important to understand how universal he means by universal. When he says don't lie, he means ever, under any circumstances, for all of time, don't lie. Right? He famously said, if someone broke into my home and with a weapon and asked, yeah, we'll talk about this over again. If someone broke into my home with a weapon and said, I'm here to kill your wife and children, where are they? He would tell them. Not even, he wouldn't say anything. He would tell them the truth.
Man.
He has a very strict view of this. And the reason is, he says, when I ask someone a question, I want them to tell me the truth. Right? I don't want them to refuse to answer, and I definitely don't want them to lie to me. I want them to tell me the truth.
Okay, if I'm
So,
a robber
I'm gonna
breaking
do
into
that to
someone's
everyone.
house, I'm not expecting them to tell me the truth.
Common criticism of Immanuel Kant, and we'll get there. But this is kind of the way he sees things, right? If it's a rule that I want other people to follow when they're working with me, I'm going to follow it for everyone else, right? It's a do unto others kind of thing, golden rule. Okay. Another example, which I think is a much better rule, is that people are never means to an end, right? Right, so you never use people to as just a way to get what you want. You always treat people as ends in themselves. That I think is a better rule because it's about treating people like people. And I think you can treat people like people without, always telling them the truth and things like that, right?
I feel like that don't lie, there's just too many situations to include in that.
There's more room for nuance with a rule like this, right? But he looks at these kinds of rules and he says, these are rules that I would like everyone for all of time and all of history to be following. So that makes them categorical imperative type rules. And that means these are my duties in life. So this is kind of the root of his view of ethics. You have these duties, which you figure out based on the categorical imperative, and those duties constitute your moral obligations. Does this make sense to everyone? Mm-hmm. Okay. Virtuism goes back to a guy I know you've all heard of, because I talk about him. Aristotle.
Oh, wow, never heard of him.
Never heard of that guy? You've probably heard about him before me, surely. Surely education is not developed to such an extent that high school students haven't heard of Aristotle.
I'm gonna go with maybe about 10, I don't know, it was in grade school you start talking about Aristotle, it's like, oh yeah, that big word.
Okay.
That big word.
That big word, Aristotle. 4 syllables, okay. That is a very short word.
Okay, I feel like in grade school, if you can say Aristotle, you're like, cool. You were cool.
Let me assure you, the reverse is true when you get to college. Ancient Athens, about the 300s, right? This guy was, he was Alexander the Great's school teacher, to give you some context for when he lived. Obviously, one of the 3 best-known philosophers in all of human history, along with Socrates and Plato. So his view of ethics starts with an idea, which is a very common Greek thing, of what is best for the city, right? Greek society is ordered around city-states like Athens and Sparta and Laodicea. And their philosophers thought in terms of the state as kind of the basic unit of human existence. And so when they say what's right and wrong for people, they're thinking about it in terms of the state, right? So Aristotle says, okay, so you have this city, and I'll draw the kind of classic image of the city. That's a horrible drawing of it. But you have the city, you have these different levels of people in the city, right? And the question is essentially, a person who lives in this city, what is it that they do that best benefits the city as a whole, right? That's kind of where he starts. The actual bones of his philosophy are that there are certain traits of character that a person has to be a good citizen. And these are words that you have heard before for the most part. They are things like courage, prudence, temperance. This could also just be a who's who of Puritan America in the 1900s or 1600s. And justice. These are kind of the big 4. There are lots of others. All right, so he says, the good citizen has these particular traits, and he calls these traits virtues. And what the virtues are, they're essentially habits that you have, right? It's not just, I'm doing a courageous thing once, it's, I'm in the habit of doing courageous things constantly, which is what makes me a courageous person. And for a city-state to thrive, its people must have courage. And must also have prudence, which is like wisdom to make good decisions. They have to have temperance, which is like you're not doing too much or too little of things, especially like food and alcohol, that kind of thing. You must have justice, which is an inclination to do right by the people around you, right? So he has these particular things, which are these narrow, sort of sliding scale, right? You can kind of draw it on a scale like this. We'll talk about it later. You have like more or less justice. He says you want to max these out in all of your citizens to have like the best possible state. So, over here, we're thinking in terms of the consequences of your actions. Over here, we're thinking in terms of the rule. And here, we're thinking in terms of the person. And this is a really helpful way of doing it, because those are kind of your three components for a moral decision, right? You have the person making the choice, and then you have the reason they made the choice, right? And then you have the actual consequences of the choice. I'm just going to draw a person on a track without a head, because you guys know what I'm referring to here, right? Consequences. This is our problems. So consequences, that's utilitarianism, right? It's concerned with that guy lost his head. We're worried about that. This is concerned with, well, why did you chop his head off, right? And this is concerned with, okay, what was it about your character that led you to do that, right? Virtuism, we're worried about the person. Deontology, we're worried about the rule or the reason. Utilitarianism, we're worried about the consequences. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Question. If you believe virtuism, can you like change your habits, or is that just something you're born with?
Yes, you can. So, and much of his book on ethics is about how you change your habits. And so the idea is, to change your habits, you do good things. Right? If you want to be a courageous person, you have just enough free will to, in this instance, I can say, I don't want to, it's not my instinct, but I'm going to do the brave thing right now. You do that once, and you're a little better at it. Then you do it again, and you're a little more better at it. You're betterer at it. Right? And so you do, and to the greatest extent that your will allow you, remember we distinguish will and actions, to the greatest extent that your will allow you, you do good actions. And as you do that, those transform your will. Right? So you shape your will, your character, into the kind of person that you want to be. You build these up in yourself over time. It is not that you just kind of have them or don't. That's more Plato's thing, because Plato was dumb.
So then, is he more of like a...
Why is he in our history books?
Long story, we don't have time to get into the history of the major central conflict in all philosophy. Plato versus Aristotle is like all of Western civilization, by the way. Any other questions on these three? Questions about what they are, how they interact, anything like that? Comments?
Wait.
Remarks?
Do they relate at all to these things? To the determinism and compatibilism?
So do like people believe in one temporal?
So, if you believe in a theory of ethics, you are probably not a determinist.
That makes sense.
Compatibilists and libertarians both at least believe they believe in free will, although the compatibilists are wrong about that. So generally, if you're a believer in any kind of free will, then the question is going to be on the table, what kind of ethics do I want to believe in? There's really no preference for which of these you will adopt, assuming you're a free will person of some kind. If you're a determinist, you're going to say, yeah, these are cute, but like you don't actually have the power to make that choice.
Right.
So wait, but out of all three of these, utilitarianism is the right, not the right one, but like the most commonly believed.
So this is just my opinion. It's not like I have a poll that I can cite to show you that, but in my experience, just talking with people, looking at the way, even just like reading articles and stuff in the news, people generally think in these terms.
Oh, okay.
Very, very much.
Because that's
Almost
how you're
all-
brought
almost
up.
universal.
So it's like,
Unless you're like a super self-centered person, most of the time
Yeah.
you're going to like think it's better to do what's going to benefit.
Right. And so that's an important point to make. That's an important point to make. It is not the case that if you are, for example, a deontologist, that you just don't care about the consequences of your actions, right? Obviously you do care. Obviously that is going to shape what you want to be this universal rule. Same with virtuism. Utilitarianism is going to care about the kind of person you are, right? So these are not 100%, like I only care about this thing type things. It's where's the emphasis? Here the emphasis is on the reason, here the emphasis is on the person, emphasis on the actions, right? They will all take elements of all three of those parts of the choice into account. It's just which one you think is kind of the final ultimate, this is where the decision is made kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So guys, what were you saying? Don't remember? Cool. Nope. So, what do we want to say by way of evaluation here? Show of hands. Who thinks utilitarianism is right?
Probably not that way.
Okay.
I
Is that two? I'm saying two half hands raised, so I'm calling that one.
I don't
No,
know.
this one-handed race.
Okay, that's a raised hand.
I don't know.
Cozy the only one?
I don't know. This is so broken.
It is. Well, Deontology. Anyone feel, and you don't have to be 100, I'm not like going to publish it in a registry that you are committed to believing this, right? But just where are you leaning? Deontology, anyone?
I don't. Oh, this is so hard. No.
No one?
Well,
Virtuism.
It's
I'm kind of leaning
Three,
towards
okay, wow.
Virtuism.
That's where I-
Here's the thing, each one, like you said, has its good characteristics. Like you cannot have full virtuism if you're not caring about the outcome of others.
Sure.
You can't have full deontology, whatever,
Yeah,
how you ever,
yeah.
I can't say words. You can't, make a decision without caring about the rules or the ways you do it. And so virtuism should be the highlighted one. From especially a Christian perspective, you should have more virtuism, but then the other two kind of follow on just in morality.
Okay. So tell me why. Why do you think this is a more Christian view?
Okay, because one thing, they talk about the four specific things. You need to have justice, you need to have courage, you need to have everything in moderation, and you need to have prudence. Versus utilitarianism, all of its things have too much room for always do the right thing, but in the wrong
Yeah, but I
way.
think God gives us a choice though, so I think that one.
Yeah, so the utilitarians would say the way you do it is taken into account. So give me an example. This is you're getting into something that is a common argument that's made. Give me an example of something that utilitarians would want to do based on utilitarianism that's actually wrong.
Well, I was just kind of thinking from the perspective of the Road to Serfdom. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I haven't read it, but I know of it.
It's a really good book, basically talking about I can't think of the big words, but it's basically making decisions for the benefit of a group of people, but leaving out a small group of people, but that small percentage of people got hit the hardest and their lives were completely destroyed.
Yeah.
And so that would be utilitarianism used in the wrong way of just, trying to do everything that they can to make this situation perfect for those people. But the people got caught in the crossfire, their lives were never,
Yeah.
they're completely
That's kind of my
So
issue with
one criticism here is collateral, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think every single one's gonna have an issue.
This is where I really love science fiction because science fiction is good at setting up situations like this. And I think there's a short story, I think it's by Arthur C. Clarke, I don't remember, in which the people all there's this great and powerful being, and as long as it's kind of set up with technology and all this stuff, I won't go into the details of it, but basically, as long as they just sit there and torture this one being incessantly for its entire life, everyone else will be happy. And if you're a utilitarian, right, that one being suffering is probably going to be worth everyone else being perfectly happy, checking all these boxes all the time. But I don't think anyone is really prepared to say, that's the right thing to do, torture that thing to death, right? So it's very easy, it's kind of a majoritarian, a view of ethics, the majority kind of gets to squish, that's not the right word at all. Gets to oppress or in other ways damage people as long as what they're doing is leading to a greater benefit somewhere else. There was a phrase for this that you have probably heard. You guys have heard the phrase, the ends justify the means?
Yeah.
This is usually cited as a bad way to think about ethics. But ultimately,
this is the view of utilitarianism.
utilitarianism says that the ends do justify the means, right? As long as you have a good outcome, how you get there, as long as the ends aren't bad enough to offset the thing that you get at the end of it, good enough. Go for it.
Yeah.
Right? Now, utilitarians will resist that. They will want to say, actually, if these means are so bad, like if these means, the classic example is the Holocaust always in these conversations.
Right.
World War II had a really flattening effect on moral discourse because now every example is the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But anyway, Hitler did what he did because he thought everyone being one race would benefit humanity. In theory, he could be taken to be right? If everyone, like, if there's all of this racial conflict that we have in the world, if you just get rid of all the races except one, that's the end of it, right? No more racial conflict. So in theory, you're making the world a better place.
Yeah, by killing a lot.
By killing a lot of people. But, like, if you figure all of the descendants of the Germans for all of time living better lives, maybe that offsets it, right? So, do the ends justify the means? Utilitarians will say, no, we don't actually think it does. We think that the intensity of the suffering is really severe. We think the quality of the good of reducing racial tension is less good than the quality of the good of actually getting these people to get along, right? So they would say there are better ways to go where you don't have to follow these means to get these ends, and sometimes the means are worse than they're made out to be, right? So you can go either side of this. There's resistance, but yes. So collateral is a common one. The other one that's often raised here is it's the issue of prediction, right? So, certainty is one of our criteria. How certain can you be that your actions will lead to the greater good long term?
How
Very
certain.
being certain.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of people who did what they thought was right, and it
Yes.
turned out to be really wrong.
And even really small things can end up making a difference. And I'll give you a World War II example since we're on this. If you are the dean at an art school in Austria around 1910, 1920, and you get this German art student that shows up, and his art's okay, but it's not really good enough to get to school, and you say no, you might think that that is an action that is a good thing because it's leading to a higher quality school, but what it actually did was it put Hitler in the army at the time of World War I, which led to all the hate that led to him doing the Holocaust, right? You don't know what your actions are going to produce. You can check all these boxes for whatever you can think of, but at the end of the day, you've got, Lord only knows how many years of future ahead of you. Where do your actions go? You have no way of knowing, right? They will try to get around that by doing, so this was a criticism that Bentham got, that Mill tried to get around, and he distinguished between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism.
Where do I put this?
So act utilitarianism says, for each decision I make, I'm going to do the thing that's going to lead to these. People say, you can't do that, you don't know where your decisions are going to go. So Mill says, okay, how about instead, we will make rules, and we will pick the rules that lead to the greatest of these over time. So instead of like saying, will killing this person lead to more pain than pleasure, you say, does killing people in general lead to more pain than pleasure? Yes, okay, we're not going to do it. That's kind of the effort to evade that. There are two problems with this, I think. One is, we don't have any idea what certain kinds of actions do, right? It would seem that preserving the integrity of your school's artistic standards would be a generally good thing. But you made Hitler happen, right? And like, there's, like, they will say, well, that's the exception. But the question is, where's the evidence that that's the exception? Right? How do we actually know what certain kinds of actions do long term? Right?
Yeah,
Maybe
but
killing
we
people
can't-
reduces the population and that's a greater good most of the time, even though it hurts someone in the now. We don't know. Cozy disagrees, go ahead.
But like, you can't like, I don't know how to say this. You can't blame that guy for turning Hitler into Hitler. Like,
Sure.
he didn't know that.
Right?
He was doing what was good at the time.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I'm confused.
So, and utilitarians will push for that, like, you know, that action wasn't the kind of action you would expect to go there,
Yeah.
right? The question raised by opponents of utilitarianism is just, if you can't know in that situation, And not knowing in that situation is kind of the normal situation we're in, right? We don't know most of the time. If that's the situation we're in most of the time, then why are we basing the decision on consequences? If we have this problem of ignorance of the future, then why do we make the future and what's going to happen in the future the basis of our moral system, right? So there are certainly a lot of people, this is the majority view not only among normal people, it's the majority view among scholars as well. So you are in good company in saying that. I don't like it. That's all, that's,
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think it's the most simplest view though,
it is absolutely
It
the
is.
most simple view. That is true.
which makes it a lot easier to understand.
Yep. And certainly when it comes to making moral decisions, a rule that is easier to follow is a better rule in general, right? So yes, that's a good argument for it as well. One of you people who said they didn't like this, what's another argument for it?
Sorry, I've never liked utilitarianism. I don't know why, I've always not liked it. Like,
Okay, so I don't know if you can bring Jesus necessarily into.
Yes, you can always bring up Jesus in this class.
Well, you know,
Theology class.
But if you think about how Jesus lived, he didn't live like to get, so he came for everyone, okay? He didn't come just for like the priests and stuff who are like morally, were up there.
Sure.
So it just, I was thinking about it and it just doesn't seem like that's what Jesus would do. Like,
It doesn't seem like this is what Jesus would do.
yeah, well, he like, I don't know how to describe it.
That's very
I
good.
don't
No,
know.
I get you because she's saying, okay, so you talked about like the emphasis, like the beliefs all feed into each other, but the
Right.
difference is the emphasis.
Right.
His emphasis was more on your character and making sure that like you, but it was like, it wasn't those virtues, it was like the biblical virtues, but his view, what he wanted us to filter things through was God's word and making sure that our hearts were right, and when our hearts line up with his and God, then our ends would be fine, and it wasn't just working to make sure that like we weren't looking for consequence to action, we were making sure that we were doing the right thing, and then trusting God with the consequences.
Right. So that would be an argument against this.
Right.
Is that okay?
That,
Yeah.
you put that into really good.
Yes. So that is an argument for virtuism, which we'll get to. I want you guys that disagree with this to argue for it.
Oh, are you
Yes.
Oh,
Yes. Well,
that's really good thing.
Part of-
So many
that's-
things
that's
I
how I
can
know I'm
argue
doing a
for
good
that
job
I
as a
don't
teacher.
agree with that.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Good thing about it is that it takes into, how to say this, it takes into consideration almost all of this. It has a whole bunch of categories, and like you said, there's more categories, but it takes into consideration
A
everything.
lot of things.
A lot
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah. So it has let's say scope.
Mhm.
It has a very broad scope.
Because like virtuism doesn't have the same kind of scope that
Right.
yeah.
This seems like it would easily cover any situation, right? Any situation is going to have
And then,
all of these. You're going to be able to put a number on it if you want to.
and then also comparing that to deontology.
Deontology, yep.
Deontology.
It's a hard word.
Is that the rules that, the two main rules that you put up there for Kant, like, don't lie. You can't always not lie, or else you are going to affect a whole bunch of people.
Right.
Or you can't always, this is not quite, true, but you can't always put people first, because then you're missing out on what you will receive.
Right. Then you might be hurting. Yeah.
Talked
Yeah.
on that like the first week.
We did. That's true. Yes.
And so,
Putting others first can be taken to such a great extent that it becomes simple. Yes. So yeah. Good. So scope and simplicity, I think, are good arguments for utilitarianism, and stuff like this is why it's more popular, right? So it's a strong view. Yeah. I'm just going to erase the names now so that it's a little clearer what we're doing. So, what can we say in favor of deontology?
it keeps you honest.
Keeps you honest? What do you mean?
Well, if you're always treating people the way you want to be treated and all of that, then you're going to be honest about your feelings, and you're going to be
Okay.
honest about, especially if you're lying, And so like all of his rules, I remember studying him, but I don't remember any of his rules. But in the end, like if you're following the rules, you're always going to be honest.
Right.
Accountability, yeah.
Yeah, you're kind of held accountable for, you're held accountable for being, let's say, consistent that your rules are not, you're not favoring yourself, right?
Yeah.
You might say, I think Kant might say, it's easy to start favoring yourself with this, right? He was very, by the way, deeply concerned about, one of his big concerns in ethics was that people tend to apply the rules in ways that benefit them. And so he actually says at one point, it is better if you always hate doing the right thing, because then you know you're doing it for the right reason.
Yeah, but
Right.
I think this rule doesn't it just puts people in danger though too.
But it
Why is
also,
Like specifically the
Because,
don't
okay,
lie.
so if you never lie, I'm not saying lying is like a good thing, but like, I don't think that you're always necessarily supposed to tell the truth. Not that you're supposed to not that you're not supposed to tell the truth, but I don't think that you need to tell people everything all the time, because that's not like,
Yeah.
like I don't need to tell you when my family's at if you're gonna come
Right.
in and shoot them, like that's not, like my duty is to keep them safe.
Right.
So I think that puts people in danger.
Yes, so a lot of people will say, deontology kind of pressures you to have rules that are so broad that you can't make exceptions when you need to, right?
Yeah.
And it really doesn't seem right that you should tell a violent person where your family is. So yes, that's a common criticism. This is not flexible enough to take in the complexity of life and human existence.
Right.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
not that I like agree with deontology, but like the Bible, the 10 Commandments line up with that. Like it says don't lie. Like literally that's all it says.
Sure.
But I
And
think
it also
Sure.
says treat your neighbor as yourself. So like the two main things.
But the thing is, God is more forgiving than
the matter
This.
is, yeah.
Oh, well, so let's be clear. Kant is a Christian and he absolutely believes God can forgive you for breaking these rules.
okay.
Yeah, but
So-
that's always
Yeah, so Aristotle is the only one of these who wasn't a Christian. These guys are Christian, most virtuists today are Christians. If that is your, if you're a Christian on any of these, you can say, this is how we know what's wrong, and God forgives you for it, right? So forgiveness plays into any of these, I would say roughly equally well.
Yeah, but oh sorry.
Well, I would just like, okay, so like in a perfect world, deontology would work because everybody would be looking out for everybody, right? So there wouldn't be people coming in and being like, tell me
Right.
okay. So in a perfect world, yes, ideally that would be fantastic,
Yes.
and there would be like the 10 Commandments rules that we could all follow, and it would be set, and everybody would know.
Mhm.
We don't live in a perfect world, and
Right.
people do come in and ask to shoot your family, and so so that isn't, it's not, you can't apply it as well as you could if it was
Yes, so I'm trying to think of an easy phrase for that.
Applicable?
It's not an applicability thing that you're describing though, it's like, this world assumes, it's utopian. That's it.
yeah.
Right, it assumes that, the world is a better place than it is. It assumes that you can get away with doing
Yeah.
things that you really can't.
Right.
I want to give a Kantian response to that. He would say that Christian ethics are rooted in something like the kingdom of God, right? They're rooted in the hope of heaven. And so part of that is that we're going to live in the world not as it is, but as it ought to be, right? We are going to live like we live in the kingdom of God because that is the only way to make it more like that, right? Someone has to be the first person
But
to do
is
this.
that,
And he
is
will,
that even deno, like is,
so he will acknowledge what you're saying, that it's deeply unsafe to live this way. And he will point out that Jesus lived an unsafe life and died for it, and he was the best person who ever lived. So he would say there is a great deal of self-sacrifice in living well. And so that would be his response to that. It's like, yep, a lot of us are going to die and it's going to suck.
I get where he's coming from, but at the same time, it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like there should be a better way.
I don't
It
think
seems like the
God
right way
would
of living
like
should be a bit more livable than the wrong way of living.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then, why wouldn't Bible be for deontology? Like, is there something that I'm missing in the 10 Commandments? Or like, just kind of focus on that, right?
So, we will cover that in a moment because that raises a good point. That is something I struck from my notes, but we'll go back to it because I think that's worth mentioning now that you've asked the question. So we'll get to that. Anyone have, what else can we say for deontology?
I had some Utilitarianism, the other one. And again, it has too
We
much
just
room
call
for
it
error.
B, D, and U.
It has too much room for error again.
Mhm.
Because even though they cover such a broad, never lie, it, again, just, there's too much error because, you can't honestly, God can forgive you, but you can't live your life based on your own actions and choices because in the end, you are a flawed human being.
Right.
And you will always make the wrong decision if you don't come at it from a godly biblical perspective.
Right. So it's too, what would be a word you would apply that?
It's too blunt.
Blunt, yeah. Sure. Go with blunt. But yeah, this idea that human beings making up these rules aren't going to understand the complexity of reality well enough to actually be able to make the right determination, even based on what might be in theory a good rule. Right? It's maybe too difficult for humans to make that judgment. Good. I think you were going to say something, Cozy?
No, she actually said it.
Wow, reading minds.
Wow, we're twins.
Yeah.
You're like stars.
Go
Yes, such twins. You look exactly
And
alike.
our mini honors.
Okay,
That's all you
basically virtues. So, what can we say in favor of virtuism?
Well, I feel like the Bible,
How dare you?
Carry on.
I feel like the Bible emphasizes more on growing your character and focusing on the Bible and being like Jesus, living your life like God, how God wants you to. There's so much emphasis on your character is so important that you'll be able to make good decisions if you have a character that is trying to follow God or to our best of our abilities.
So I'm going to say easily biblical here, because each of these views will certainly find things in the Bible that they feel support them. This is the one that's easiest to draw that connection. That does not necessarily mean that it is the best view, but all else being equal, you would say it is.
I think it also has a little bit of science behind it because science says if you do something once, it's easier and easier, and that's the basis of virtue.
So it's rooted in kind of a psychological.
Psychological,
evidence.
that's a good word.
Another thing is, so last year, I have this reasoning strand that I do, and the whole question for the entire year was what is virtue? And so we went into, Plato's dialogue of Socrates.
Socrates, yeah.
Sorry.
That is literally a lot of the original Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Oh, we're going to meet this guy named Socrates.
No, I know it's Socrates. So his discussion, especially we read one of Plato's, Socrates discussion books, dialogues. There you go.
His dialogues are very they're the philosophy text, just so you know.
Yeah. And so anyway, so we talked about, the idea of what is virtue, and so we had to write an essay on it. And basically, we took some virtues out of other books. And so virtues are always a great way to start your ethics from, I feel like, because, especially if you come at them from a biblical perspective, you will always be able to find, the errors in it aren't, as big a deal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's understandable. So both of these kind of tend to assume, this tends to assume that we have a lot more information than we do. This tends to assume that we are, let's say, better reasoners than we really are. This is kind of easy to comprehend, right? It's easy to wrap your mind around, okay, I need to be more willing to face things that scare me than I am, right? This is nice, easy, and self-contained without being oversimplified, because there are many of these little self-contained things, right? So yes, it's got kind of this portability to it. Yeah. Sure.
Also, I would say that when you're filtering things through your virtues, it kind of leads into the other two, right? So it's gonna help you reason better if you know where you're coming from, and then you're gonna get a better consequence because you know where you're coming from. So it's you're starting from the right point.
So I think it's a good argument. I'm not going to put it on the board for the simple reason that each of these people would say the same thing the other way, right?
It doesn't work
Right?
like that.
No, these people would say it's a great pleasure to understand the world better, to be a better thinker.
But you can't
And
look
that
at it
benefits
from a
the world.
consequence.
And they would certainly
say
say each
it's
of the
gonna be
virtues,
this.
they would certainly say each of the virtues has a tendency to lead to better outcomes, right? So each of these are going to have these kind of, these like sort of logical circles that lead them to being able to say, yes, each of these is actually subsumed under our system. So,
I feel like it's just logical to go this way, but I don't know.
yes.
It's like a better order. Like they all do it, but it's a better order.
It does feel that way, but like that's, I don't want to give that the weight of being on the board for the simple reason that these people would not agree with it. So I want to be fair to them to say, we feel like it goes that way maybe, probably not everyone even in the room thinks that way, right? If you're cozy, it maybe makes more sense that
I'm still Unitarian.
yeah. So that's an impression that is easy to have if you already lean this way, but it's not necessarily something everyone's going to agree with, right? What can we say against virtuism?
It, just like the priests, like I think like priests in the Old Testament, in the Bible, especially the priests that persecuted Jesus, they were virtuous in the sense that they cared about their character and how to make them better, and I'm this and I'm
It was really
that.
Self-centered,
Self-centered,
yes.
yeah, exactly.
Or let's say self-focused, because virtuous would definitely say being self-centered is a vice. But that idea that you're focusing on who you are and not looking out at the world more tends to create a problem.
It's also, what was I thinking? It's also, can't think of the word. It's like, this isn't the word, but this is how I'll describe it. It's like kind of childish, because if you're always looking at yourself and never looking around you, then you'll miss something, or you're gonna get hit in the head, or like you'll trip or something like that. Like if you're always thinking, okay,
Naive, I think is the word
naive,
I'm looking for.
yeah.
Yes, it seems to have this air about it that if you are only looking at these specific traits, what's in the gaps and is that going to hurt you? Where this seems able to fill in the proverbial gaps a bit better.
Yeah.
Good. Anyone else? Contra virtuism.
It's hard to come up with.
I'd say if you don't have like a biblical worldview, it's really hard to be like, well, why do I need all these really good, why do I need like
Yes.
temperance and why do I
How
need
do you
prudence?
anchor?
Like
Yes.
that doesn't matter if you're not thinking, how can I best please God in my decisions?
And I think that can go also for all of the other two. If
Yes.
you don't have a biblical worldview, then why do you need
Yes. Why do I have to
Right.
care? Why do I care how anyone else feels?
Right.
Yes. So.
But I feel like it's easier
but-
because it's like I just want to be a good person
Yes.
versus I want to be pleasing to God.
And what's going on there is that it is more, we have this kind of built-in instinct for right and wrong. This aligns with that better than this does, right?
Right.
It's much easier to say, I should benefit people and not hurt people.
Right.
That very much just resonates with how we feel like ethics works. If you're on this, not everyone feels like temperance is something that you should do, right? It's
Right.
It's less sort of
Why do I
residential.
have to moderate what I take in?
Right.
And what I do?
Right.
Why
So
do I have to stop?
when you break it down and you make it hard to do, you get less of that, like, yep, that feels like the right thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because it's easier to be like, well, doing a lot of this brings me a lot of pleasure, so clearly that's the best thing for me to
Right.
do.
And so that does lead to, in the world of secular philosophy, this question of how do you anchor this? That these two are not really made to face as much. Whether you think that's fair or not, whether you think these have an anchor that this doesn't or not, that's the way it plays out. These people just assume, yep, obviously that, obviously those are good starting points. This, you might need a little bit more, right? And so the starting point is, for Aristotle, the starting point is like the benefit of the city, right? So he's almost kind of going back to utilitarianism and saying, we want the city as a whole to be well off. That's kind of how he anchors it.
Right.
Obviously that doesn't really apply now, so you get different ways of anchoring this. So yes, that's good. Does anyone else want to throw one on there?
I mean, I think virtuism, I think that one, it's easy to believe in because, I guess they have one thing going for them is being self-focused, like you can really looking on yourself and really be biblically strong, I guess.
So you're going to look at this.
Yeah.
You're arguing for it, right?
Yeah, because I think that's one thing they do have going for them. But
Right. So Cozy is saying, maybe there's a good reason that we focus on ourselves when it comes to ethics. Maybe
No,
it's
there always-
us that needs to be transformed.
Well, yeah, because you,
Well, there always is a good time for you to focus on yourself,
Sure.
but I feel like virtuism is too much looking on yourself.
yeah, no, I definitely agree, but I think that you can't you have to have you have to be able to focus on yourself a little bit, because if you don't focus on
Right.
yourself and you don't know what you believe, then there's an issue already.
Right, right.
And
And
so-
there is this idea that you focus on the thing you can change, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Right, right.
very good.
yeah.
So, with some red and green on the board, does anybody think they've changed their position? No?
No.
I think I have more virtuism.
Okay. So we have what, 4 virtue and 1 utility?
Utility.
What are your
Okay,
thoughts?
yeah, that can sound kind of, this is our internet provider right here.
Okay.
Cozy is
Like,
terms.
what is she, electrical?
What are your thoughts on this?
So, I follow the bulk of Christian tradition historically in holding the virtue view. It is interesting though that this view, the view that basically all Christians hold, not basically all, a very large percentage of Christians hold, is also the view that it wasn't invented by a Christian, right? These other two were
Yeah, right.
invented by
Yeah.
Christians for Christians. So, yeah, I do prefer virtuism, and I think for me the biggest reason for that comes to that anchor question. I think that it fits nicely, and we'll get into this in a minute. I think that it fits very nicely with I think that Judaism gets you to a certain point, and then virtuism and kind of that Greek philosophy tradition is able to pick that up and run with it really smoothly. They feel made, to me, they feel made for each other. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So I think that it squares well with Christianity.
And then also with the fact of Aristotle not being a Christian, but still creating like the general like ethics that
Yes.
most Christians follow.
It's like God
It's-
has, yeah,
Aristotle was made by God, and God implanted in Adam and Eve,
Mhm.
you know, these ideas of character, rules,
Yeah,
and all
absolutely.
of these things. And so,
The moral law of
whether,
God is written in all men's hearts,
Right.
what it says, yeah.
so in the end, even though he wasn't a Christian, God still used him.
Right. And there's this interesting thing. So Aristotle was before Christ, right? Aristotle never met a Christian or a Jew. But
do you think
Aristotle,
he would have been a Christian if he was
So-
born at a different time?
so Aristotle, he was trained by Plato, who was an
He
atheist.
was what?
He was trained by Plato. Plato was his teacher. Plato's teacher was Socrates, who was a normal, like, run-of-the-mill Greek polytheist. But Aristotle said, I don't buy either of those. I think there is one being who is so good that everything else is centered around him. And that's what makes the world go round. On his own.
I love him actually. He's absolutely
didn't
He's
know.
brilliant.
I
He's
love because
absolutely
like
brilliant.
he totally came up with this concept of God before
Yes,
thinking of the concept of God.
yes, he thought
I
of the
literally
idea of God.
love
He thought of the idea of God all on his own without ever having met a Jew who were the only monotheists.
And everyone thought he
around.
was crazy because he's like one being. Come on, dude, that's a
Right, especially where he lived and like
Yeah.
what's going on. Everybody's like,
No, absolutely astounding.
Yes.
And he is the greatest mind in all of human history, and I think it's telling that that's where he landed, even having no cultural leanings that way.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yes.
How is he not a Christian? How is he not a Christian?
It
If
wasn't
people
him.
Christianity.
Christ.
He
And
was
he was
in
so
the
he
Christ.
was never and he was in Greece, so he
So,
never had Jews.
you
he
were
was
getting
like, had no
into-
concept of it.
You were getting into the question of, are people before Christ saved by Christ?
Right, that's what I was.
Most people would say Jews definitely are. But what about the people who weren't Jews before Jesus?
Right.
William Lane Craig, who's one of the theologians that I read a lot, has argued that Aristotle is in heaven.
Well, because
I-
yeah, his
I-
vision was like
I
that
hope
when I
he's
studied it.
right.
There was a lot of those where I was
But
like,
like, I really
It's
was trying to
really
get
hard.
because I want to talk.
Oh yeah, I want to meet him
I
next
want to
time.
sit
Yeah,
down.
he's fine, you can't have him.
nobody else.
Nobody else.
I
Yeah.
know me.
If you do, that's sad.
Turn my car down.
We can talk about this all day, but I do have some other stuff that I want to get to.
Let's see Aristotle.
Are we ever gonna go back to that question if people?
What's
your question?
We will talk about hell in, I think, 4 weeks, and we'll cover that question.
What was your question?
I can't put it
Do
into
people who
words.
aren't Christians, how might people who aren't Christians, especially before Jesus, go to heaven? So there's a view that I didn't cover, which is called divine command theory. This is the idea that right and wrong just comes down to what God says.
Right, because the Bible are the sins, this is what you should dwell on.
Right, so you've got things like the 10 Commandments, you have 613 commandments in the Hebrew law. You have the various moral, let's say, declarations of Paul and the other writers of the New Testament epistles. These people would say, your moral obligation comes down to what's in those. So Sarah Grace, you asked a question about, is one of these views like more scriptural? Where is the Bible in like the utilitarian view versus these other ones? The reason I didn't include this is because everyone, including divine command theorists, agree that the Bible does not address every possible situation, right? There are lots of things. How often should you be on your phone? What does the Bible say about that? Nothing, but work phones, right? So, what do you do with that?
There's holes.
Right, there are a lot of holes. 613 rules is not nearly enough.
Because especially like if you think about it, the 10 Commandments were made back way long before Jesus, way long before
Yeah,
modern
like
technology.
1200 BC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's also like
So-
a lot of commandments in the Bible that were meant to like help people stand out during that time
Right.
period that aren't
The
necessarily
so-called
as
ritual law.
prevalent
Yes.
now. So.
Exactly. So, we have this problem where the Bible doesn't seem to give us everything we need to have a well-worked out system. What divine command theorists do with that is they say, well, you don't just take the literal statements there, you take kind of the principles out of the commandments in the Bible, and you kind of apply them as principles. The problem with that is that those principles tend to be either based on the person making the decision, or they're based on the reason you make the decision, or they're based on the consequences of the decision, right? So what divine command theorists end up doing is they reconstruct one of the three major views
So it's like
from
follow
Scripture.
the Bible
Right.
plus this.
Yes, and so it's kind of like, well, you're not wrong that the commandments of God are moral duties. You're just wrong that that's a system distinct from these big three. So there are plenty of Christians who will say, this is my view of ethics, and I don't hold any of these three. They're making crap up. They hold one of these three, they just don't realize it, right?
So divine command theory is just kind of like all three of those?
Usually they slot themselves into one of these three without realizing it. But they end up holding one of the other.
They say,
What do the majority
this
slot
is
themselves into?
That's a good question. I would say they probably tend to slot themselves into virtue ethics, just because
Yeah.
that's where Christian tradition kind of tends to push you if you aren't explicitly like
So
looking
then
at
is
that.
it wrong to hold the utilitarian?
No, absolutely not.
Not wrong.
I think you can be a Christian and hold any of these views. The question is just which is more useful for like doing the right thing, for figuring out what's right and then doing it.
I think it's more so like, how do you actually like use that view in your life and like, how does it like affect you and stuff?
So, Sarah Grace, to your question about where is the anchoring of Scripture in these, the answer is Scripture has certain commandments and certain declarations of who God is. We draw on those to get some system of what we think right and wrong is based on God's character, and you can systematize them as any of those. So, it's pretty hard to look at Scripture and pull out a system, because Scripture is mostly written by Jews. Even the parts that are written in Greek are written by Jews who do not really think in this way of like systematizing. Here is the list of rules that you're going to follow. It's not really how Judaism works. It's much more kind of what would you say? It's vaguer, and it's vaguer because it's trying to leave room for the complexity of the world, right? And so when you take that less precisely stated stuff from the Old Testament, because it's imprecisely stated, you can kind of make it work in any of these three. So the Bible, because of that, we don't really get a specific, this is the biblical system. We get, these are biblical commandments, how do we work those out as a system is a theological question.
And
Does that
that's why
make
there's
sense?
three systems,
Right.
and not just one.
Right, exactly.
That makes sense.
So, with apologies to Cozy, we are going to assume virtuism going forward for this class.
Majority
And
rules.
this is an issue with designing a class like this, right? Because one of the important things to do in a class about sin is talk about like particular particular instances of right and wrong, give actual like cases. And the fact is that to do that, you really have to pick one. And virtuism is just easier to do that with, right? It's really easy to go cover all of the virtues.
Yeah.
So, it is completely okay for you to hold a different view. And certainly you can learn a lot of things about right and wrong studying the virtues even if you aren't a virtue person. So, yeah, there's nothing wrong with holding the view you hold. We are going to work within the virtue framework going forward. Apologies. So with that said,
Okay, I'll get over it.
with that
You're
said,
gonna still learn. Just because you gotta apply everything your own way. You're gonna be smart.
Really got it.
so Aristotle's anchor, we talked about the anchoring for virtues. Aristotle's anchor is this idea that he has of the perfect citizen, right? The perfect citizen of the state, the person who always does that which greatly benefits the state. This becomes problematic because this person is imaginary, right? You have to imagine the perfect person, which generally means you're imagining a specific situation that might not be the one that's applicable. Imaginary people are kind of hard to work with.
Yeah.
So, what Christians do is they step into a world where Aristotle is, he's like 300 years in the past, but his philosophy is kind of all the rage in the Eastern Mediterranean world at the time, including in Israel. And so, Christians, following the writing of the New Testament, picked up on the writings of Aristotle and said, you know what, we're going to put a face on this guy. That perfect citizen, supposedly, this person who's the anchor of all of it, that's going to be Jesus. These are sandals.
Those look like footballs.
You know what?
Beard and sandals.
Yes.
Yes.
When Jesus resurrected, his body actually stayed there.
It was just
It wasn't like a different- his beard's gone. He was Where are the sandals? I guess he's walking around somewhere. Okay, we have limited time, so I wanna go over this. So when I say that I feel like Aristotelian ethics, Aristotle's ethics, square really nicely with Scripture, the whole of the Old Testament is leading up to this Messiah guy, who is the perfect person. And then you have this system of ethics that says, imagine the perfect person. Now what would that person do? It's like, gee, Jesus really sits nicely in between those and links them together. So this is why a lot of Christians like virtuism, is because it just squares so nicely with this idea of the Messiah as the morally perfect example, right? So it's become very popular for that reason. And now we're going to get into some of the core terminology of virtue ethics. And one which I mentioned for the first two sessions, and you guys were really mad because I wasn't making it clear. What is the difference between, oh yeah, and by the way, actually we should do that first. What is the opposite of a virtue? A vice. Versus vice.
That's a really long verse, Lane.
Yes, it is. I like long verses.
Sorry, I heard you say vice is a vice, advice.
Advice, yes, this is total advice.
We cannot have advice here.
Anyone who tells you to commit vice is giving you bad advice, okay? So, virtue versus vice. So virtue is, and remember what I said, these are not individual acts, but habits, right? And so then you have sin over here, right? These are sins with a small s. And over here you would have good deeds. I'm just going to abbreviate that, okay? So, virtue versus vice, these are good habits of character, right? I tend to do the right thing. I tend to act with courage. Over here is I tend to act with envy, right? Envy would be an example of a vice, right? Now, yes, it is. I know this. You know what? I don't need your judgment. So, let's take the example of courage, right? If I'm a soldier in a war and I run away from battle, I've committed a particular sin, right? Right, I've committed a sin, so to be cowardly is a vice, right? So cowardice is a vice.
And courage is a virtue.
Right, and courage is a virtue. If I commit the sin of running away in battle, I've committed a cowardly act, right?
You
So-
forgot that young cowardice.
That's the new way to spell it.
That's
Howard.
Okay, so all sins are expressions of vices. Does this make sense? Vices are vice is the habit of doing sins. So we have a distinction here. We've got habit versus action, and then we have right versus wrong.
Can you say the definition again of sins? Like the all sins are something another?
So sins are examples of vice, right? They're instances of vice. Vices, I have a habit of doing a bad thing. The particular bad things we do are sins, right? So that soldier who runs away in battle, that's a sin. That he's in the habit of doing that every battle is a vice. Does this make sense?
Ah.
So virtue ethics is less concerned with sins, and it is more concerned with vices. We're concerned with more the kinds of things you habitually do. We are more concerned with the person you become as a matter of habit than we are with their particular wrongs. This is something else that seems to square nicely with Christianity, right? Christianity, your individual sins are forgiven. God's concerned that you become like Christ, much more than he's concerned that you do any particular good act, right? This is where our focus is. So, for that reason, also, I think that that's a good view for Christianity. And the last thing that we'll do today. So what is the opposite of courage?
Cowardice.
Okay. What else is the opposite of courage?
Like fear, pride, or like over.
Yes, there we go. Overconfidence, or so we would call it brashness.
I've found that word for it. I just know I would.
So,
You feel like you're invincible.
virtues and vices are not pairs, they are triads. Okay? You have two vices. You have a vice of what's called a vice of deficiency, right? You don't have enough resilience to fear if you're a coward. And then you have a vice of excess. You are too resilient to fear if you're brash, right? Instead, you want to find what's called the golden mean, right? The average, the middle ground. So virtues are these, man, I can't write. Virtues are these middle grounds between two vices. So one good thing to make note of, it's said in sermons a lot, and it's not wrong, that you want to run as far away from sin as possible.
Right.
It's a good thing understood the right way, but it's important to
Don't
remember.
run too far.
Yeah, it's important to remember, if you're running far from cowardice, you might be running away from that sin so hard that you're running straight into another one,
Just
right?
pass courage on
Yeah, exactly. You pass courage on the way.
the exit.
Right? So you want to be thoughtful about, speaking in terms of, let's say, spiritual tactics, it is a favorite strategy of the devil to get you so worked up and so afraid of a particular sin that you might commit that he pushes you to the other level, right?
Whoa.
And so you see things like, you will see people who, let's say when they're young, they're kind of like meek and timid. Some of those people stay that way their whole lives. Some of those people actually learn courage. Some of them are so driven by their worry at being meek that they become these over-aggressive, brash, bad people, right?
Whoa.
So this is a good lesson to, this is one of those things that you should note down and take away in the way you live your life. Watch out when you are resisting one temptation that you don't fall into the other. Does that make sense?
So, oh my gosh, my mind is just like, oh, I just can't.
And that's something that's kind of deep in our culture, right? That you think, oh, well, good and evil are opposites. Well, no, good is a middle ground between two really bad things. What might be an exception to this? Something we've talked about before.
Idolatry.
Very good.
Because you can't worship too much. Sorry,
What is-
remember what Taylor said when we were talking about
So if the highest virtue is worship, like we talked about, and the ultimate vice is idolatry. Right? Idolatry is what we just called a vice of deficiency, right? You're not worshiping enough. What might be the vice of excess regarding worship?
Would that be worship? No, right. To yourself? No, that's idolatry.
Yeah, well that would be idolatry. You're worshiping something that isn't God.
Right.
How can you worship God too much?
There's no way.
You
It's
can't.
like Caleb said. You can spend hour after hour after
Exactly. And a lot of what Caleb said last night, by the way, does play into this. He talked a lot about like shaping the person you become, and he talks a lot in general about like forming habits and things. So many people in our church talk a lot about habits, and that's drawing on the virtue tradition, right?
Oh,
But this one, being sort of capital in the sense of being the head of the others, there's no vice of excess for worship, right? This is, for me, another really good argument for why this is the like top vice and virtue, as opposed to for those who weren't here, we talked about pride is usually what people say is like the head vice, but
you could get idolatry.
yes, I think it's idolatry.
Which I like that.
One of my preferred reasons is that you can certainly have. Oh wait, I just made pride a virtue.
That's what I did this class. That's it.
Is a vice of excess over what we might call humility.
Right.
But you can also have what we might call the vice of deference, right? This is the vice of caring about yourself too little, as opposed to the vice of caring about yourself too much. So the fact that the vice of idolatry has no opposite, and this one does, I think is another good reason to think that idolatry is the one at the top. It stands out from the others by virtue of being unopposed.
I really like that, the idolatry.
Yeah, I think it's
It makes most sense, especially with Christianity.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Like it's like every other page for like 5 books of the Bible is, and this person sinned in God's sight and worshipped other gods, and they did not follow the Lord their God, and God was displeased with them. It's every like it's over and over and over again. It's the first commandment, and yeah. So the evidence is quite strong. So I just want to give you. We're over time, so if you guys need to go, you can. Don't feel bad about leaving if we're over time. I just want to give you real quick. There are 2 kind of classic lists. You have what are called the 7
Deadly sins.
deadly sins. I do not call them deadly sins. I do not want you calling them that.
Because they're all,
Because
sins
so
are deadly.
what's the difference between a sin and a vice?
Oh,
Because
okay,
the
that's
sins
your, okay, now I get it.
Yes, they are not sins, they are vices, because they are habits. And we also don't say deadly because they don't kill you. This is a confusion that happened. The original name was the 7 capital vices.
Okay, well, some deadly sins sounds
That-
So,
sounds
yes,
like-
7 deadly sins rolls off the tongue better. So you get this confusion where people see capital and they think capital punishment, and so they say deadly. Capital? No, that's actually,
The only conclusion to draw.
that's actually what happens, because but the capital actually comes from the Latin word for head. And these are the kind of head vices that lead to all the others. And they are, let's see, how many do we know?
Envy.
Envy.
Anger.
Envy, anger, which classically we call wrath.
Gluttony.
Glutton, greed.
Lust.
Gluttony,
Lust.
greed, greed. Did I say greed?
Lust.
Gluttony, greed, lust.
It's like
Sarah's really passionate about it. Well, I heard
Listen
this
to-
sermon on
Pride.
What?
Pride.
Pride, very good.
Right, and
Okay,
But it should have the one that everybody goes through.
36. I almost said anger again.
It's an animal.
It's like a
Talking
dragon.
animal.
Well, they all have They all should have
It's
the
like
Sloth.
laziness.
We will talk about these. And so the next few weeks of this class is going to be kind of breaking some of these down. Sloth is not really laziness per se, but we'll get there.
It's
Opposing these, you have what are called the 7, well, it's not really 7 though because it's split up. So what you have are the 4 cardinal virtues. And these are kind of the ones Aristotle came up with. And they're the ones that I put up before. So they are prudence,
temperance,
temperance,
courage, and justice.
courage, and justice. Very good.
Okay. Can't give you justice.
And then in addition to that, you have, so when Christians kind of take over the virtue tradition, they add what are called the 3 theological virtues. Okay, this one is basically copy and pasted out of the Bible. What are the 3 like biggest virtues?
Love the Lord your God.
Worship.
Worship.
No?
Oh, is that love, peace, and joy?
Love, peace, and joy.
Just reciting it.
Patience and kindness, right?
No, because
Kindness
love
was
is
that.
patient.
So kindness and love are usually called the same thing.
Yeah,
I can't
We obviously don't know our scriptures very
Fatigue.
well.
okay.
Faith,
Okay.
hope,
Oh my God.
faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. What? Yes. Yes, the virtue of fatigue. You will make a good engineer this week.
I'm so tired.
Well,
There
you've got
is
me
some of the
stop
slaughter
it.
hours today. I know. No,
Oh,
wait.
sorry.
I have the cardinal virtue of tiredness.
Tiredness, yes. And by the way, fun fact, so why is this cardinal?
Because it's
It's like worldly, for lack of a better term. Like these are like things that like people like the world like kind of just see as like good, right? Like kind of just like
What does it
like
have?
built in. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like
So what, but what is, so why do we call them cardinal though? Why that word? You're not gonna guess it, so I'll just tell you. So,
we're not
never failure.
I did, I apologize.
everyone here except for Amy's homeschooled.
So cardinal comes from
Sick
the,
everyone's
comes from the Latin word for a door hinge. So in modern English, we might call these the pivotal virtues,
Oh.
right? They're the virtues around which the others.
I was thinking of the bird.
I was thinking
So that's usually where people go. So you have cardinal, the color, like the red, cardinal red. You have cardinal the bird. You have cardinal, which is a class of archbishop in the Catholic Church.
Well, that was the other thing I was thinking of. Do
So-
you have to go to the church or do you mean the bird? Or like what?
There are a bunch of different meanings.
What
then
other
they come back
cardinal
to
are we going for?
door hinge, which is what that means. Yes. So next time you see a Catholic cardinal, if you ever do, bring them as a door hinge. and see what they do. They'll probably know what you mean because they have to learn Latin.
How do you go from door hinge to like a priest? Like,
So they're kind
That's
of
okay.
they're kind of that around which the church turns, right? It's like the turning points.
This is a fun little
Okay.
side note. Is the Latin word for cathedra?
Wait, don't erase that. Oh, dang it. I was gonna say comment.
Go for it.
Zero
What was
John,
your-
I misspelled justice, and I
Oh, did I?
was trying to still think of it.
She's trying to be clever. She didn't have enough time.
So you were talking about cathedra.
The Latin word cathedra, which turns into English cathedral, which is, a Catholic cathedral or whatever, a church, it actually means easy chair in Latin. And it's actually typically used for women.
That's rude. Guys, we are an easy chair, and we are the Catholic Church, apparently. A cathedral.
Yeah, and so you'll hear phrases in the Catholic Church. They'll say things like, when they say the Pope is infallible, he's not infallible if he's just talking to you in conversation. He's infallible when he speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair,
Right.
which is like referred to his office. So you,
Right.
when you know Greek and Latin, you get to see these little things where you can make these interesting connections that you wouldn't notice immediately.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the church is the seat of God, right? And so we call it a cathedral.
But it's
That
a
makes
woman's
sense.
easy chair.
Hey, you know what? God's got to be comfortable in his house.
Yeah, for sure.
Regarding theories of ethics and virtuism, questions, comments, rude remarks.
My rude remark is gone. I didn't know how to make it.
So we'll leave it there for the day.